Interpol are one of the leading bands of the 2000s post-punk revival scene. Their debut album, Turn on the Bright Lights, is just an incredible album that is widely considered one of the best indie records of the past couple decades. And when you hit a home run on your first inning, it's very rare that you don't spend the rest of your career struggling to ever reach those heights again. Although they were incredibly close with their follow-up, Antics, which is also a near-perfect album, they spent much of the late 2000s and 2010s releasing albums that were very hit or miss. Their last album, El Pintor, is in my opinion their most underrated album, is one I am personally a big fan of. It does try really hard to recapture that lightning in a bottle that was their first album, and it doesn't quite manage it. The album is a little bit safe at times, but the songwriting shows clear maturity and progression, and although it may times be kind of lacking, the album overall is pretty decent. And that brings us to their 6th album, Marauder, which is pretty much the exact same album as their last one. The album comes hot off the heels of the band's 15th anniversary tour for their first album, and it's definitely clear that going back and playing those songs have had a huge influence on the songs written for the new record. The album mixes the very raw and atmospheric sound of their first album with the safer and simpler songwriting of their last album, which in a lot of places does work really well, but in other places it doesn't work quite as much. The album opens with the incredible If You Really Love Nothing, which is full of these bright, slightly crunchy guitars, driving drum rhythms, and the band's signature melancholic sound. The song is essentially a spiritual successor to Stella Was a Diver and She's Always Down from their first album, and it follows this isolated character whose rejection of love leads to their psychological dissolve. It's followed up by the album's lead single, The Rover, a very bouncy and urgent rock song. I love the guitar interplay on this song, especially with the blending of those high guitar notes and the reverb heavy octave notes. The song is easily one of the most exciting and memorable tracks on the album. It's followed by Complications, a song that is similarly bouncy yet way moodier. There's this almost reggae sounding rhythm to the song, which blended with that spacious post-punk sound creates something really unique and different compared to the band's other work. And of course there are songs like Flight of Fancy, Mountain Child, Stay in Touch and Surveillance that just sound like classic early 2000s Interpol and could have easily been B-sides from their first 2 albums. The rest of the songs on the album don't really stand out as anything too memorable or even worthwhile, to be honest. It's undeniably Interpol, but it feels like Interpol running out of ideas or just simply phoning it in at times. Not to mention there's those 2 interlude songs that really add nothing to the album except to just extend the track listing. Like, they could have just been codas at the end of the previous songs. They didn't need their own tracks. There's not really any songs on the album that I think are particularly terrible. There's just quite a few filler songs on the album that I feel like stops the album from being up there with some of my favourites from the band. But if there's one big problem I have with the whole album that brings it down, it has to be Paul Banks' vocals. He has an incredible voice and there's no denying that, but on this album he makes a lot of really odd vocal decisions that sound really pretty bad. He constantly sounds like he's straining to hit high notes, like he has a cold or something and is trying to push his vocals to their limit even despite the fact his voice is barely there. And this is something that is a problem on pretty much all of the songs on the album, including the ones that I really like. I remember the first time I heard The Rover, I hated it because of his vocals. It took me a few listens to really get over that style. And the closing track, It Probably Matters, could have been really great and possibly my favourite closing track from the band, but his vocals ruined the whole thing. I will admit that even despite the album's faults, it's one that I found myself wanting to return to quite a few times. Although there are tracks that I don't like, as a whole experience I find the album to be much more enjoyable. Although not quite as good as the band's first 2 releases or even their last one, it's them being themselves and making very raw and straightforward post-punk. It could have been a lot better, but it could have been a lot worse, and I can't deny that the album has a lot of really great standout moments. I completely see why one would love or hate this album, even if I personally aren't on either side. Marauder isn't the big return to form that people are saying it is, but it's Interpol doing what they do best, and it's full of songs that over time I think can become some of the most revered songs that the band have ever done. I give it a 7.5 out of 10.